First, there's a reminder of that story of Mullah Nasruddin. Now we know that Mullah Nasruddin was rather a comic character, but his fame had spread far and wide as being somewhat of a mystical magician of sorts. But there was a certain seeker who had heard of Mullah Nasruddin and decided that he would go and find out what he was about. So he came upon the mullah and decided that he would watch to see what he did. And he saw the mullah go and sit under a tree. And the mullah put out his hand, and in it appeared a bowl of sherbet, sweet sherbet. And then he held out his other hand, and his hand was filled with a plate of delicious halwa. Well, the young seeker was beside himself and couldn't do anything else but hurry over to the mullah and say, Mullah, I want to be able to do what you do. Will you take me as your student? The mullah said, yes, but first you have to pass a test. Oh, yes, said the young seeker, tell me anything. And the mullah said, well, do you want the easy question or the hard question? Well, this young seeker thought he had advanced somewhere along the path as a seeker, so I'll take the hard question. So the mullah said, well, tell me, how do you make a hole in your garden fence big enough for your chickens to go and peck in your neighbor's yard, but not big enough for his chickens to come and peck in your yard? And the young seeker went stumbling off down the road, scratching his head in great perplexity. The mullah stood smiling to himself and thinking, yes, he's on his way. You know, it's been mooted that every character and every element of these stories is an aspect of ourself or an aspect of our psyche. So let's see what this Sufi story can bring up for us. It's a story about a beggar who spent his nights sleeping on the outdoor oven of a certain very rich family. And in the daytime, when it was the time for prayer, he would go and stand on the steps to beg for a few coins. But it so happened that just as the sun was coming up, and our beggar was curled up on the top of the warmth of the oven, a vendor came down the road, a donkey pulling his little cart, on the back of which was a cage, which had in it several tiny gazelles. He was ringing his bell, saying, who wants to buy a gazelle? Who wants to buy a gazelle? And our beggar gestured to the vendor. Shh, the family doesn't wake up so early. Be quiet. What is it you're on about? And the vendor said, gazelles, buy a gazelle. The beggar said, I don't need a gazelle and I don't have any money. But just as these words were coming out of his mouth, one of the tiny little creatures put its head outside the cage and whispered, buy me. You will not be sorry if you do. Well, our beggar was very surprised, but then he said to the vendor, well, I've only got 3 copper coins. How much do you want for these creatures? And the vendor said, oh, anything. I'll take anything because, I'd have to feed them anyway. So the beggar offered his 3 copper coins to the vendor, and he was given the tiny gazelle that had put its head through the bars of the cage. The vendor went off, heading for the nearest coffee shop, and the beggar scratched his head and said, "Oh, what have I done? They were the last copper coins that I have." And the little tiny gazelle said, You will not be sorry. I can make you rich." The beggar laughed to himself. And then the little gazelle said, "Just wait here and I'll be back." Well, the little gazelle danced off, and the beggar stood there bewailing what he'd done, thinking he'd never see that creature again after his having bought its freedom, and he'd have to wait until the time of prayer before he could go and earn a couple of coins, maybe to buy himself a cup of coffee. But as it happened, the little gazelle went off to the house not too far distant, that was the abode of a very illustrious prince. And the gazelle approached the prince and said to him, "My master is a very rich merchant who has been beset by robbers, and though they did not get all his wealth, they took all of his clothing, so he does not feel worthy and could not present himself to you in the state in which he finds himself. Would you be good enough to give me some clothing that I can pass to my master, so that he would be presentable to be in your presence?" Oh, the prince said, "Of course," and he instructed his servants to bring a shirt of the finest white linen, and a pair of pants, balloon pants such as were worn at that time. And the little gazelle said, "My master does not want to be a beggar," and he dropped at the feet of the prince a beautiful stone. Well, when the prince picked up this stone, he thought, "Oh, this merchant must be a very rich man. I'm very glad that I have not given my daughter's hand in marriage to anyone else, because it seems that he might be a suitable husband for her." The gazelle went off with the clothing on his back, and when he arrived, to the great surprise of the beggar, the gazelle said to him, "Go, bathe in the river, and put on these garments, and come with me." Well, after the beggar had bathed and put on these fine garments, he was indeed a splendid being. And the gazelle said, "First come with me." And trotting down the road, they came to a wall, and the gazelle pointed, "Just remove several stones from the base of this wall." And when he did, the beggar found a treasure. Well, he was richer than he could ever have imagined, and he stuffed his pockets, his robes, with all that he could fit. And then he followed the little gazelle to the abode of the prince. When they arrived there, a very amiable greeting was exchanged. A sheep was killed, and there was feasting and much palaver that went on between them, after which the prince offered the beggar, now resplendent and rich, the hand of his daughter in marriage. The marriage took place, and the beggar, now a rich man, languished. He spent his days playing backgammon with his friends and being waited on by his servants. And the months passed. But then one day, the wife of the beggar, now a rich man, happened to notice the gazelle lying, looking very pale and ill. And the gazelle said to the wife, "Please, will you ask my master to bring me a bowl of curd and sweetened with honey that he has made himself? I am ill and afraid that I will die." So the wife went off where her husband was playing backgammon with his friends, and passed the message, saying that the gazelle was ill unto death. But the beggar, now a rich man, said, "I have no time. Can't you see that I'm busy? Give the gazelle the curd and honey yourself, and leave me to my game." So the wife went back and passed the message to the gazelle, who said, "I can only take the curd and honey made by my master's hand. Ask him, beg him once again, lest I should die." But again the beggar, now a rich man, refused. When the wife went back to give the message to the gazelle, the dull eyes closed, and the gazelle passed away. That night, when they were in bed, the beggar, now a rich man, said to her, "Oh, what happened to the gazelle? You forgot to tell me." And the wife said, "It has died, and I have to tell you that I no longer love you. When my father comes back from his travels, I am taking my dowry and returning to my father's house." That night, the beggar, rich man, had a dream when the gazelle came to him and spoke words to him that made him feel shamed and sorry. In the morning, when he awoke, the beggar found himself back on the top of the rich man's stove, wearing the ragged garments of the beggar. Supposing that every element of this story represents an aspect of our self. What is the gazelle for you? What is your gazelle? What does that story mean for us. What is the gazelle representative of as an aspect of our self?